The leaders of the United States, Canada and Mexico have all condemned what they called attacks on Brazil's democracy. The joint statement came ahead of talks in Mexico City between U.S. President Joe Biden, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and their host, Mexican President Manuel Lopez Obrador. The North American Leaders Summit is expected to focus on economic issues and climate change, but also the situation on the U.S.-Mexican border. On his way to Mexico City, Biden stopped in El Paso, Texas, and this was his first trip to the border as president. While campaigning, he had promised to make immigration a top priority. The number of migrant crossings and apprehensions has risen dramatically during Biden's first 2 years in office. There's also concern about an increase in drug and weapons smuggling and human trafficking across the U.S. southern border. Migration will be a tentpole issue at the summit, but there are other big problems facing the region. Democracy and freedom of speech, for example. DW's Carolina Chimoy reports.
This is Joe Biden's first trip to Mexico as a president. His agenda for the North American summit is clearly driven by issues that are important at home.
Very important agenda, three big topics: climate change, migration, and drugs, particularly fentanyl, and the president's looking forward to addressing all three.
In the streets of the Mexican capital, opinions about his visit are mixed.
I want them to focus on economic agreements that benefit all three countries. It's unfair he's closing his borders and leaving all migrants in Mexico.
I don't care about politics, it's dirty.
Professor Humberto Beck is worried about the path Mexican democracy is taking.
The first is the relationship between the Mexican state and the armed forces, which have increasingly broader functions beyond the military strategy. The second is the fight that the current government has waged against the independent electoral authority, which would imply a diminution or even disappearance of the autonomy of the electoral body that would in fact benefit the party in power. The third is that President Lopez Obrador has adopted a polarizing discourse that actively stigmatizes his political opponents as enemies of the country.
In a polarized society, independent media is crucial. But being a journalist in Mexico is dangerous. More journalists have been killed in Mexico in 2022 than in any other country in the world. Most of the victims are from local media outlets. This is the first time that a journalist has been directly attacked in decades in Mexico City. His name is Ciro Gomez Leiva. He is one of Mexico's most famous anchors. He was shot several times on his way back from work just before Christmas.
Fortunately, the armor stopped the shots. I leaned to the right. I tried to lower my head. I could see the motorcycle ahead. And from the center, they shot at me, hitting the windshield. I know that they wanted to kill me, but I don't know who or why, and I have to live with that uncertainty. Someone tried to kill me, and 3 weeks later, we still don't know who or why.
Democracy and freedom of speech are usually important pillars when Biden addresses foreign nations. But here at the summit, in the presidential palace in Mexico, they are apparently not on the agenda.
I'm joined now by Christopher Sabatini. He's a senior research fellow for Latin America at the U.S. and the Americas program at Chatham House. Good to see you. It's the first time Mexico has hosted a U.S. president in 9 years. Where does the bilateral relationship stand?
It's very difficult. As your report mentioned, there are a number of issues that are important to the United States. Migration, obviously, that's become really a third rail, if you will, in U.S. politics right now, that has really been dominated by Republicans and sort of xenophobic elements within the Republican Party and right-wing media. It really complicated a more institutional method to resolve it. There's also the issue of drugs, fentanyl now. It's not just obviously marijuana and cocaine, it's fentanyl and opioids that are coming across the border. Over 100,000 people died from fentanyl overdoses and opioid overdoses in the last year. But then there's also the issue of democracy and economic development. And the U.S. needs Mexico's cooperation on the first two issues, migration and drugs. But for Mexico, a large issue is this is going to be economic development. U.S. assistance, investment is going to be key, as well as the issue of democracy, as your interview said, and very good interview, on the issue of the armed forces, the independent electoral authority, and freedom of expression. The U.S. really can't push on those issues precisely because it needs Mexico to sort of stop immigration at the border. It's now sort of claiming that it's going to get, if any of the 4 countries that are now going to be included in what's called Title 42, which is a element that allows the U.S. to reject undocumented immigrants from, will now actually, they'll have to come through the countries in Haiti, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And if they don't, they're counting on the Mexican authorities to stop them at the border and hold them there. By the same token, obviously, the drug issue, the Mexican government just arrested the son of El Chapo, Ovidio, and it produced a massive wave of violence in the state of Sinaloa. Yeah. But the U.S. is counting on Mexico to combat this, so it really can't raise the issues of democracy because it doesn't want to effectively anger AMLO, who has a very thin skin, is very nationalistic, and is really very much engaged in a very autocratic political project.
Yeah, and their interactions so far have seemed purely transactional, haven't they? And Joe Biden is someone who always says it's very important to meet face to face, you know, to mend ties, to forge a connection. So what about the 2 leaders' personal relationship?
You know, it's funny, as much as Trump was, former U.S. President Donald Trump was offensive in his rhetoric, talking about Mexico was going to build the wall and Mexico was going to pay for it, and all sorts of racist rhetoric about Mexicans. The truth is in some ways, despite Donald Trump being of the extreme right and AMLO being of the left, they actually got along in some ways because there's a certain transactional relationship there that really doesn't exist with Joe Biden. Joe Biden isn't willing to sort of trade some sort of things just to get some concessions, and he's to be quite frank, he's less of a bully than Donald Trump was. And AMLO, at a certain level, I think understood that and respected it as a fellow populist demagogue, if you will. And of course, Joe Biden has to raise issues of trade as well. Right now, for example, it wasn't mentioned in your report, but there's a huge trade dispute between Canada and the U.S. with Mexico over recent laws that favor Mexican energy companies and the provision of electricity and energy generally that actually break with climate change concerns, as well as break with the NAFTA, the former NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, now called the USMCA, that has to be dealt with. And basically, AMLO has said that he will pull out of NAFTA, or threaten to pull out of NAFTA, the free trade agreement, if the U.S. doesn't respect their autonomy to set their energy policy. So there's a lot of conflicting issues right here. It's a very delicate dance between these 2 men.
Mm-hmm. We only have about a minute left, but I do want to know if you expect any major announcements to come out of the summit.
I don't think so. First of all, the announcement on Brazil was very positive. I think that is a demonstration of solidarity. I think there'll be some improvements on migration. I think Mexico will probably agree to cooperate with the United States on migration. And I think the arrest of El Chapo's son is a demonstration that Mexico wants to do a lot more, recognizes it needs to do a lot more on security. Other than that, though, especially on trade and investment, I don't expect much.
Christopher Sabatini of Chatham House, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much.